welcome to the Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy, the free podcast for motivated teachers and school leaders who want to inspire their students and school community in literacy learning. Make sure you subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast player, and for more amazing literacy resources, check out the show notes provided with every episode.
Hi, I'm Sharon and I'm the host of A Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Firstly, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. And welcome, Phil.
Thanks, Sharon, and welcome to part 5 of our podcast on high-impact strategies for struggling readers, years 3 to 6. Wow, how did we get here, Sharon?
Yeah, we know how we got here. I just overtalk things. But I think there's importance in that. Like, that's for each of these sections. I mean, we did, to be honest, we did think this would be, a 2-part podcast.
Yeah.
But as we have been exploring each of these strategies for supporting struggling readers, years 3 to 6, there are many parts to say about these strategies. And we have chosen strategies that are significant, not just, maybe think about this. They're all heavyweight, high impact.
And we've, as teachers...
As
teachers, we've seen them work with our students.
Yes, we've seen how much worth they have for students.
And not surprisingly, the research backs it up.
Exactly.
Yep.
Well, we would have been driven by research in the first place.
Absolutely. Being members of ALEA.
Yes, the International Literacy Association.
And various other organisations, PETA.
Yes, Primary English Teachers Association.
A wealth of knowledge from those organisations helped us in our own teaching.
Yes, and the mentors who have come from those organisations. And I think, one of the things that we as teachers can feel like we're a bit in a sea of, like, there's a lot of things, especially a primary school teacher needs to develop knowledge around, to feel the same kind of confidence in their teaching that they're wanting to give to their students.
Yep.
And so that's why I suppose we're trying to honour, in essence, these 4 strategies that we're talking about in these podcasts, because they're not just an isolated strategy. They are something that each of them plays an important part in our literacy teaching to support students who are not yet thriving as readers.
So if we get on with our podcast now, Sharon, we're going to try and keep it within a time limit, but we're not sure. And I'm a little bit worried about Sharon's whole pile of books here. I should take a photo of it, really. You call it a gaggle of books or something? What do you call it?
Well, we will now, because that's amused us heartily, hasn't it?
Yes.
I know. I think I'd call it a trove.
A trove of books. But before we go on, we've just come back from Melbourne, which was lovely. We had a lovely trip over there.
Is it the trip to Melbourne, or is it the work that we did in Melbourne that's for me, meeting a new team of teachers that I will be working with, and not just teachers, but the leaders that are driving that work in the school. So exciting to meet them and to be in conversation around the very things that they are driving down as teachers and want to expand their knowledge of and their learning of. And interestingly enough, the topic of this podcast was a big topic of conversation over...
For struggling readers?
Yes.
Oh, right.
Well, for struggling readers, for all readers, but especially, we haven't even mentioned, topic for today is the importance of reading aloud for our struggling readers.
And that came up with the teachers? Or?
It came up, the value and importance of read aloud, and this is a school that already values it, has high value, And I'll tell you where the questions came up. How can we make it work more effectively? We know the power of it.
Okay.
But how do we get real engagement? How do we get... Yeah. Actually, that was the big question.
Because there's read aloud and then there's read aloud.
Yes. And of course, that comes back again to purpose.
Yeah.
Why are we reading aloud? And I think we talked quite at length about that in children selecting books and having independent reading time. And we made that differentiation then that if we're choosing quiet reading or sustained silent reading or reading after lunch, or if we're using that as a calming time or as a fill-in time, that's different from it being, I'm not saying that's not a purpose, but for the purpose of teaching.
Teaching reading.
And for reading to become an action of readers.
Yeah.
And that's a key point here for the purpose of read aloud. Yes, we want to be reading to children aloud, for them to enjoy that experience and get great enjoyment out of it. For our struggling readers, and we're already using that term reader, so it's the child, it's not the process, it's being a reader.
Yep.
And read aloud has a really important part to play. A teacher reading aloud daily is a significant research-based strategy for supporting the struggling reader. And so that's what we'll explore is what does read aloud bring and enable for the struggling reader.
Yeah, it's great to make that connection too with the school you've just been in and what the current needs are with the teaching.
And then that's the other really critical point. When we think about what are our principles around teaching and learning success.
So your pedagogy.
Yes, using our students to inform our teaching.
Yep.
So what is it? And I think it's a fairly fair comment to say about you and me, Phil, that it was the students who we wanted to help. We wanted to help all our students, but the students who we could see who were struggling or striving, we did a lot of great learning in that space, I felt. For us as teachers, like really thinking about, I want to be able to help every child here. I want to be able to progress every child in their development as reader, writer, speller, mathematician, all of the areas. And it's looking at, okay, what is it that they need? And I think read aloud formed a big part of our teaching.
Well, Misty talks about children needing a deep well of language, of grammar, of vocabulary to draw on.
Yeah.
And really, that's one of those key strategies, isn't it? For doing just that.
Really noticing what our students are needing as readers. And I think it's that point, as readers, we can talk about teaching reading, but actually we're teaching readers. And our struggling readers, we need to include them in all of the things that all our students are getting. We don't want to be exclusive and say they can't have access to, certain elements of being a reader, which is what I think read aloud really is. Like read aloud demonstrates actually the whole point of being a reader. When we've got a fluent adult reading to us, we're coming to a really clear understanding of what it is to be a reader,
it's
all of the aspects of it.
Is it a bit like I'm practicing my musical instrument, my tune that I'm practicing, but when I actually hear the whole orchestra play the tune that I'm involved in, I actually get to hear how it all comes together?
Well, I think it's how it comes together, but we get to do that with the person reading aloud. We get to do a whole lot of reader processes along the way. So what does research tell us about the benefits of reading aloud? So listeners who've listened to other podcasts, especially when we reference Allington and Gabriel's work, Every Child, Every Day, one of those Every Child, Every Day statements is every child every day listens to a fluent adult read. And from that, Allington and Gabriel can tell us that listening to an adult model fluent reading increases the following things. It increases students' own fluency and their comprehension skills. It expands their vocabulary. It expands background knowledge, sense of story, awareness of genre and text structure, and the comprehension of text read. So that's a huge range of reader behaviours and understandings that come through that process, through read aloud. And I am going to say that I do feel a bit underwhelmed sometimes about what can seem a very narrow view of what children need to become readers. Right. And by that, I mean if we just say children need to be really efficient decoders, I totally agree that they do, but that is one small part of a very big picture about what it is to be a successful reader. And Allington and Gabriel, by looking at many classrooms, have found that it's often in our first 2 years of school that children get read to a lot, and then that can drop off after that time because the value of it isn't seen as a high impact strategy.
I was going to say all those things you mentioned of the value of read aloud. I think at times as teachers we kind of lose sight of how many things that we are addressing through that read aloud. Yeah. And sometimes it's a bit like silent reading. We'll just do it because it just keeps the kids quiet. They're all engaged and listening to a great story. But we're not realising what amazing impact that is having.
Yes, yes. And when we go through that list, you know, there are things we know we're to be addressing and that children need, but we might be doing those as separate activities. Whereas here, I think the importance of read aloud and the things that it brings together really help us to see that it can be such a powerful part of every day because it is addressing so many aspects, not just addressing, integrating so many aspects of the reading process, because the reading process isn't made up of all these separate elements. It's the integration and orchestration of all of those elements that create successful readers. And so I think read aloud is powerful for the struggling reader just in the very act of it being a collection of so many elements of reading and not just isolated pieces.
Coming together to see the beauty of it, the joy of it, the wonder of it.
Yes.
But also, you know, it's a teaching tool as well, isn't it? It's not just enjoyment.
Yes, yeah. And if we think then, and we had big conversations about this yesterday, about what is it to be a reader? Yes, there's lots of processes that we're doing, but at the end of the day, we want to be a reader so that we can just have access to the world of books, to the world of information. And that's why writers write. Books are there, yes, to entertain, but to help us understand more about the world and about ourselves and about others.
And especially these struggling readers get this access. These older struggling readers get the access that they might not get through just reading.
Yes, exactly. So that brings us then to thinking, well, what makes a good read aloud? How do we go about choosing good read alouds?
Hi everyone, just a little Teachific promotion here. We encourage you to become a member and access thousands of quality literacy resources through teachific.com.au. These have been developed from real work in Australian classrooms. We also have a growing number of online courses with expert presenters to guide you in the how-to of great teaching and learning. Bye for now.
Now, it's a range of things we should be reading across the year. Do we leave it to chance and say, okay, we'll just pick up book by book, we'll find something, need to do a read aloud today, do I think we want to be a bit more intentional than that to make it a successful process.
Have a plan, Sharon.
Have a plan, exactly. And in fact, we will put in the show notes some resources around that. Mary Lee Hahn has written a whole book on reconsidering read aloud, and one of the chapters is just about that. How do we go about choosing books? Will also be an article up there years ago. I wrote, developing a read aloud program. Planning for me around read aloud was so critical about what kinds of books did I want my students to experience across a year. Now, read aloud, we generally say that we want that book to be at a higher level than most of the readers in the class. And by higher level, by decoding level and by thinking, by comprehension level.
Literary.
We want it to be a stretch of thinking, because read aloud, we haven't even mentioned this part, instantly means we are a community of listeners here. We are all hearing this story or this factual information from a fact book. We're all listening to this. Nobody's excluded. So our struggling readers aren't excluded by this. They are part of this. And we've chosen a book. We want it to be above their level because we want them to be able to access things beyond where they are. And that together we're going to be able to do the big talking, the big thinking, the big wonderings, the big unravelling of what's happening in this story.
And all of us can do that.
And all of us are part of that.
Yeah.
And those strategies that we are teaching, the think aloud that we might do as a teacher, but not too much thinking aloud, because the ones we want doing the thinking are the children in front of us, our students. They're the ones that we're really guiding them, not by asking random questions, but by getting them to do the thinking. For example, as we were talking yesterday, we really were focusing on some summarising strategies. But in this chapter, notice what are the events, what are the significant events happening in this chapter. Let's sort that out. Let's think about it. Let's just jot that. Because why are events important? Because that's leading to the plot. That's the plot line of the story, these significant events. So what I'm saying is we can read with intention, but to engage our students, we also want them engaging in thinking strategies, in thinking about text and giving them ways to be thinking, but not thinking as in answering closed questions, doing the thinking that good readers are doing, no matter where you are as a reader. And for many of our struggling readers, their level of comprehension outstrips maybe their decoding strategies. So let's honour the thinking that they can be doing around text, and let's let them engage in that kind of work. Really, what I'm saying, it's at grade level and above, because those books we're choosing are really more complex texts. Let's look at what are grade level expectations, and let's push our students to achieving that kind of thinking and be exposed to that kind of vocabulary and be exposed to various types of text structures and various genres, including informational text, as well as fiction text and different types of, fiction texts, mysteries, fables, biographies, historical fiction, whatever the range is at grade level, Australian curriculum suggests some real ranges of texts that we can read, including poetry. So intentionally thinking about the books that I want to bring to students is part of that planning. Now, where do we choose those from? If you've got a librarian, they're a good person to, someone to recommend books to you is a great thing. We've tried to offer some of that through Rebecca Bird from Peggy Williams Books and Genevieve from Where the Wild Things Are bookshop in Brisbane. They have been regular on the podcast with book recommendations. And that's such an important way to build our knowledge of, I think, what is new. Like, I'm not saying we don't want to bring children the classics, but we want to keep reading as well as a teacher. What's new? What's interesting? What's come out? What's maybe a verse novel? I've never read a verse novel to my students.
Well, here's a great story for you, Sharon. When I was a young teacher, I would go down to the Peggy Williams bookshop and actually walk in there, and it was just books everywhere, just amazing. And I'd hear this little voice down the back saying, "Can I help you?" And it's Peggy Williams, and she's not very tall, but she was just such a fountain of knowledge of... She'd read so many of those books in that shop, and she could just recommend so many things to me.
Yes.
And I was always excited going there and, buying some of those books for the classroom.
Yeah. And let's be real, Phil. Nothing's changed, has it? We're always down at the bookshop.
True.
we're always looking for the next books, what's new out. Of course, Children's Book Council.
It's interesting to see, though, that, we would think with the electronic age there would be the demise of books, but the bookshop near us is just getting bigger and better, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. Well, because let's think about that process then. That we choose books because we can open them up, we can look at them, we can read a bit of it. And I know electronically we can do those things too, but a bookshop gives you some choice and presents books in a way too that draws you in, that really says, like story from yesterday, one of the books that I took to the school was Woven of the Word, which is Woven of the World. And it's this great picture book. And the literacy coach that I was working with said, "I've never seen that book before." Now, I had not come across it in any other way except that it was at the end of a bookshelf, front cover on display, and I was captivated by the book. So I don't know if I'd have come across it, if I was on a online site looking for text. So I guess... it's that idea of being someone who wants to go out and search for books. And
I think it's quite exciting finding a book that a lot of the kids in your class haven't read.
Oh, yes.
And you come out with it and you've read it, or even the first chapter you've read, and you realise how...
Well, it's good if you've read it entirely.
True.
Because you actually need to be sold on that book.
Yeah. Anyway,
for it to be of benefit.
And you read this book and then... Not many have heard it, and they're blown away by it.
Yes, yes. Another really great thing that came up in conversation yesterday, which I think is another really important point for all of our readers and our struggling readers especially, is yes, it's nice to see yourself in a book, but it's also really important to be taken outside of yourself in a book.
Good point.
And to see other worlds, other ways of being. Like, that's what writers are bringing to us. They're bringing to us things that aren't necessarily in our world. And that's an important world lesson, isn't it?
Well, it creates empathy, a depth of knowledge about the world that you didn't have.
Yeah.
It creates a joy about the world.
Yes, an interest, a curiosity, a wandering around, so it's not just how sort of like with electronically, we can sort of be a bit corralled now into, being given things that are of interest to us, and we get more information about that, when in fact what's really healthy for us is to be outside of just the things that we know. We want our children's world to be getting bigger and larger. I think this is a good way sort of to stem back to the idea that teachers will often say to me, look, children, they don't enjoy read aloud because they've never been read to. That's the very, very cue to go, okay, I need to get read aloud going. Mm. And how do I make it work? I think there are some practical things about that too, and that is bringing everybody in close to you.
Yeah, don't have them sitting at their tables.
Yeah. And even if your room is small and you've only got room for a small number to be sitting at the floor with you, well, then have the rest at that first section of tables, but have people close. Have them close enough so that they can watch you as you gesture as you're reading.
Oh, gesturing is very important, isn't it?
Yes, well researched that we can demonstrate some unknown vocabulary. So rather than stopping all the time to explain words we can gesture to show an action or an emotion or a response to something, a slight gesture. We're not doing a full-blown theatrical performance here, but we're subtly gesturing to give meaning to the things that we're reading. When we go, okay, that's going to be when someone dips their head forlornly, we can demonstrate that. We can just do it as we read it.
Yeah, that's great. Mem Fox talked about also just putting your arms out at 45-degree angles.
Oh, yes.
And then have your class make sure they're within those angles. And then you don't have these children on the periphery that...
yes, the rollers, the crawlers. Yeah.
And that works well. But on the floor works well. 45-degree arms out.
Yes.
Works well. I've also tried putting some really fascinating words that are coming up in the story on the whiteboard.
Well, you know that I'm the lover of the A2 big book.
Oh, that's true.
The blank big book. And yes, words, if they're not on the whiteboard, on a chart somewhere, new and interesting words that we're coming across, but not just words, phrases. Because for our years 3 to 6, there's so many more literary devices being used in our texts and idioms, turns of phrases that are often used that children don't necessarily understand. So those phrases...
Fantastic opportunity for them to learn about these things.
Yes. So we can just extract those up on a chart that can be used again because they're likely to come across those in more complex texts that we're trying to get them into.
And can be used in their own writing.
Yes. So this use of vocabulary in story, there's actually one other thing I need to say about vocabulary because I was asked the question yesterday, do we stop and teach vocabulary as we go? We want our year 3 to 6 readers know that writers give us so much information as they're writing that there may be a word or a concept that is a bit more unfamiliar to students. And then we find that what follows the mention of that concept or that idea or that word, we actually find more detail about it in the following sentences or the following sentence, or sometimes after a semicolon or a dash. So we really need to teach our students, let our students know and become aware. So through our reading, to point those things out, to go, we might be aware that, there's a new word for us or something new, but let's keep reading. Like, let's check in. Often a reader is going to give us more information about that. So that's what more complex text does. We don't have illustrations to give us a whole lot more meaning around concepts and ideas and words and places. Now it's words that are doing it. So it's the writer who's doing that through more detail in their writing that builds bigger pictures around concepts, ideas, and words. So we can see if struggling readers aren't given access to those more complex texts through read aloud, then they don't know what it is to do in more complex texts.
Yep.
The read-aloud is actually what builds a lot of the strategies that they need to get into the more complex texts, because they may have been a child who has had a lot of decoding work being done with them, and that's not enough to get them into the complexity of reading and the complexity of the texts that they have the right to be moving into as readers.
And we'll take a break there from part 5 of our podcast. We look forward to you joining us for part 6.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. To make sure you don't miss any literacy learning tips and insights, please subscribe to our show on your favourite podcast player. At Q Learning, our literacy specialists draw on over 30 years of teaching and international consulting experience to deliver world-class learning solutions. We equip, empower and support teachers to become their authentic selves. To find out about upcoming webinars and about how Q can help you and your school, visit qlearning.com.au. And you can get even more amazing teaching resources right now at teachific.com.au. Stay tuned.